Hello, I am so honored and excited to welcome you, all of you, right here to the Plural Positivity World Conference 2019. So, for months we worked so hard on this conference. The idea is getting presenters, getting them to record videos for you that are informative and that we can learn something from and grow from together as a community. And it worked out because we're here. So 2019 is the perfect year for the very first DID conference online ever. As in 2019, it's been 25 years since MPD, multiple personality disorder, became DID, dissociative identity disorder. And so we think this is a perfect year to do this groundbreaking conference. We have over 30 different sessions by 20 different presenters, and we are so excited to share this information with you. There are so many great sessions that I will go over quickly later in this video. So to give an explanation about this video, you will first see me give a little bit of an explanation about the conference, the speakers, the sponsors, that kind of thing. And then we will watch together the System Speak podcast, Dr. E, with our keynote session. So as you can see, this session has a live chat option right next to the screen. Or if you're on your phone, it might be underneath the video. You can use this live chat feature to chat directly with the speakers during their session. So you can ask questions about what they talk about while their session is playing. This is unfortunately not available for every session. We've tried our best to provide the chat option, at least for the sessions where the speakers can be available themselves as well, where there is an exception for this session, as I'm not actually here myself right now while I'm only doing the intro. Dr. E from System Speak is doing the keynote, so I guess it's okay. Later today, I will be back for my own session, DID 101, and so there I will be in the live chat, but right now I'm not there, but my amazing team is. So let's talk about a little bit about who Plural Events is, what Plural Events is. So Plural Events is definitely not just me, it's a whole group of people, Plural and DID, who came together with the goal of creating an umbrella community and an umbrella term, Plural, was already kind of there by the community, and to bring that together and to provide information from different perspectives so we can learn from each other, we can bridge the gaps between our communities and create that umbrella and create a louder voice to be heard in the singular normative world. So since it's been 25 years this year, we think this is the perfect moment to start. Well, it would have been more perfect if we started 25 years ago, but I guess the internet wasn't up to speed yet. So here we are in 2019, creating this conference for you, inviting you to join in, not just you, but all of you. All of your system is welcome to listen in and to learn from this experience. And this resource will be online, available and for free to all of you. It will be on the internet as long as the internet is here. And so we hope you can go back later in life to these resources and find the information you're looking for, so you can always continue to grow and flourish in your life. A few of the conference sessions will be live, including a panel session, which we are super excited about. So for these live sessions, both the speaker will be live and the chat will be live. So that is a great way to interact and to ask your questions as well. I will now read to you a little bit about our keynote speaker and the keynote session they will be giving today.
In this part of the session, I'm excited to introduce to you, honored to introduce to you, our keynote speaker, Emma Sunshaw, Dr. E of System Speak. Emma Sunshaw, PhD, earned her BS in Human Development, her MS in Professional Counseling, an MDiv in Pastoral Counseling, and an MS in Hebrew and Jewish Studies, and her PhD in Marriage and Family Therapy. She is a licensed clinical professional counselor, LCPC, in 2 states, as well as a certified chaplain. She's been in private practice since 2004, with additional experience in ER triage, inpatient psychiatric, residential treatment, school-based, and outpatient settings. She is the author of more than 14 books, over 300 published articles, and an international speaker and frequent guest lecturer. She is married to her husband, a musical theater writer, and they currently live in Kansas City. Emma and her husband served as foster parents for 4 years, fostering more than 80 children and adopting 6 special needs children, 10-year-old triplets. One is deaf with cochlear implants like Emma, One has autism and one has cerebral palsy. 6-year-old twins, one has reactive attachment and both have fetal alcohol syndrome. And a miracle baby, now 3-year-old, who was born without an airway and is on palliative care. Emma and her sister were diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder by a licensed therapist and psychiatrist following inpatient treatment for a significant fugue experience and related trauma issues. Prior to this experience, Emma had functioned well for 20 years as a doctorate-level clinician, until both her parents passed away. The layers of this experience triggered a collapse of protective walls that had thus far sustained them internally, leading them to seek treatment. Finding appropriate and quality treatment was more difficult than expected, and Emma now travels 4 hours from home for weekly 2-hour sessions. While continuing to provide consultant work, writing and presenting as a speaker, Emma Dr. E has retired from clinical work and does not maintain an office caseload at this time. In presenting for this conference, she is sharing information and experience only and not providing any medical or therapeutic advice. Emma and her system began their global podcast System Speak when they recognized the need for an ongoing DID-related podcast to educate themselves and others. System Speak is about documenting one journey, educating many, and finding her own voice. It's about finding a way to bridge the gap between survivor and clinician. It's about advocacy, fighting stigma, and adding substance and quality and rawness to the online conversation regarding trauma in general and dissociative identity disorder specifically. System Speak podcast is available on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, and most other players, as well as the website systemspeak.org. Keynote session. The Counter Conference, a timeline and call for renewal. How we got from the very first documented case study in 1584 to where we are now, a brief history of DID, an explanation of the unfolding diagnosis through the history of the DSM, and an introduction to modern issues in the clinical world. The benefits and limitations of the ISSTD and related organizations will be explored, and updates on most recent research will be given, as well as reasons for recent changes in research to be explained. A call for renewal will be issued in an effort to bridge the gap between the clinical and survivor communities, and this call to action will address current clinical issues, including appropriation, oppression, and the rights of plurals in treatment and as a community of survivors.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope that was interesting to you and that you are so much looking forward to this session by Dr. E. We are. I want to take a second to thank our sponsors.
In this part of the video, I want to give a special thanks to all our conference supporters. Our major sponsors, these folks have given outstanding support or financial contributions to make the conference a success, which is Eclectic Tech LLC, included Liberated Life Coaching, and the monetary sponsor of kinhost.org, with owner, admin, and adventurer Reverend Chris Itterman, aka The Chris's. Power to the Plurals by Sarah N. Clark, including Alternation on Facebook, their YouTube channel, and website powertotheplurals.com. Support in the memory of Rhonda Bunkelman. And our keynote speaker, Emma Sunshaw from the System Speak podcast. We also want to thank all the presenters for the hard work that they've delivered. Thank you so much. Without you, without your sessions, this conference would not have been the same. We also want to thank all our other volunteers. Many hands make light work, and you proved it once again. Thank you so much for captioning all the videos, for all the work you've done in the background, for monitoring this conference, the comment sections and the chats, the live streams. Thank you so much for liking, sharing, and enjoying our content. We truly appreciate our community and what we're building together under the Plural umbrella.
That are not just the people who sponsored us financially, our Plural event financially, not us, no one got paid. Everything was done for free as a donation of time and resources and effort, and as a gift from all of us, the presenters, to you, our wonderful community. This conference has only plural speakers besides one ally. So everyone is plural in this conference, and we hope that it's a massive sign to you that you can live a very fruitful and successful life with DID. And all of us here at Plural Events wish that for you and everyone else that is living with DID or as many. The conference will last until Monday, so even on Monday we have sessions still available for you, so please keep that in mind. It might be a bit different than what you're used to. So even on Monday we have fantastic sessions. You can find the full schedule of the conference at revx.us/schedule, and the link to that is also in the description down below. For every video, if you hear a link mentioned in the video, it is down below in the description, and also the link to the original creator can be found in the description. So please take a minute to look at the description after watching a video to see the extra disclaimers, information, and links. And please know that trigger warnings can also be found in the description, so look for those up front if you need them. And I guess some of the titles will also give it away if there are triggering subjects. We've tried to keep everything as accessible to everyone, and so that includes avoiding certain extremely triggering topics or going too deep into a topic as to avoid triggering and keeping everyone as safe as possible. Please use self-care. Please rely on your system to make it through these 3 very intense and filled days. And we are looking forward to spending some time later with you today in the live chat and during the live stream. Thank you so much. Enjoy the keynote session and the rest of this conference, and see you later. Bye, everyone.
Emma, Dr. E, thank you so much for being willing to speak here at the Plural Positivity World Conference 2019. We are honored to host you. The stage is yours.
Hello, welcome to the keynote address for the Plural Positivity World Conference. While this is a Plural Positivity World Conference, I have been asked specifically to speak about the history of dissociative identity disorder, or DID, as we understand it thus far. We will also be sharing the results from the survey after further data analysis. But we do want to thank everyone for participating, as we have thus far had 223 responses from 27 countries. The history of DID is in almost every book about it, but none of them are exhaustive. While we can review these early cases and the first diagnosis with the multiple personality label, it is wrong to assume that these were the earliest cases or experiences. The case studies given credit for the identification and categorizing are only the first to formally document and label them according to modern science as we understand it now and with records available. It does not mean that these pioneers in treating dissociation invented it, or that these were the first cases of it. It should be assumed that the cases of dissociative identity disorder have been around as long as people and trauma have existed. In her 2019 book, Rachel Robertson reports the history of DID goes back at least 4,000 years. Ancient cultures describe many cases of dissociative identity disorder through their stories and art. Many of these are reframed as demonic possession or misrepresented through westernized and Christianized documents. Some cultures still view their healers and shamans as multiple without it even having any negative connotation, until they were persecuted through genocide by Western religions such as 300 years of the Inquisition. But for the sake of today's discussion, and to answer the questions about why we even need a counter conference, in an appeal to the ISSTD and its conference currently happening in New York this year, we will focus on more recent history and the Western medicine perspective. In 1584, Jeannie Ferry was the first woman to document her own case of multiple personalities. though these words were not yet used as diagnostic labels. Her documentation preserves the early identification of symptoms that correlate with the modern diagnosis, including multiple alters with their own names and identities, lists of their features, and descriptions of their different roles. She described protector personalities, persecutory personalities, and child personalities. These personalities were associated with the different sets of behaviors that ranged from self-harm to helping her heal to disordered eating. They all had their own voices, both when she spoke and inside her head. They all had different knowledge, capacities, and skill sets. She herself documented that they resulted from childhood abuse. Jeannie Ferry's account in a now ancient text is no different than the modern-day blog, podcast, or YouTube video series. What feels like validated history to an outsider seems very familiar to those of us who are survivors. Those of us who share our stories do it to document our progress and make sense of our experiences, not to garner attention from people already too quick to judge or dismiss us. 10 years after Jeannie Ferry, Paracelsus was born in 1541 and grew up to be a Swiss physician, alchemist, and astrologer of the German Renaissance. He was a pioneer in several aspects of the medical revolution of the Renaissance. He spoke and published about a woman who had amnesia about an alternate personality who stole her money. This feels very reminiscent of the modern-day case study, such as those often shared at clinical or public conferences. In 1623, the story of Sister Benedetta was published. Sister Benedetta was a woman who was supposedly possessed by 3 angelic boys who would beat her to cause chronic pain. When they took control of her body, each would speak with a different dialect and tone of voice while using different facial expressions. Benedetta had amnesia for some of their actions, including a sexual relationship that they had initiated. Like Jeannie Ferry, Sister Benedetta suffered from self-harm and disordered eating. Her parents had also shown signs of dissociation and had been rumored to be possessed, and one of the angels was frozen at age 9, the same age at which Sister Benedetta's father had died. Her symptoms had become uncontrollable, and she had been sent to the convent. Angels were the fictives of the 1600s. Taken from religious texts and cultural experiences and religious beliefs, these characters were apparent alters but in non-human form, much like the dragons and aliens and wolves introjected from modern-day cultural exposure. In 1791, Ebert Gemlin published the first known detailed case study of multiple personality, which he called exchanged personality, in reference to the switching between the 2 or more personalities. The 20-year-old German woman could speak perfect French and speak German with a French accent when she was the French woman, but only knew German when she was the German woman. The French woman knew everything the German woman did, but the German woman didn't know what happened to her while the French woman was out. Eventually, these 2 could switch intentionally when prompted by him, but only after some time of working together. They could not do so early in their discovery. The judgments for and against this case feel like those that come from harsh clinicians who don't believe in DID, or from cold clinicians behind microphones that don't like that DID looks different from their expertise, or even from the DID community itself, when survivors cruelly compare stories or judge themselves or each other, when in reality they've had different experiences and are in different stages of healing. Benjamin Rush is known as the father of American psychiatry, and was the only signer of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He was the chief surgeon of the Continental Army and worked with many children and adults who suffered trauma because of the war. In 1809, he published a 4-volume set of books about treating mind disorders called Medical Inquiries and Observations of the Mind. In these essays, Dr. Rush included the concept of multiple personalities, which he referred to as doubling of consciousness. He reasoned that the cause of this happening in trauma patients was a disconnection between the 2 hemispheres of the brain. This was our first sign of hope, that the shame of the impact of DID was not entirely ours to carry, and the first validation we received from the neurobiological impact of trauma. In 1811, Samuel Mitchell identified both Mary Reynolds and Rachel Baker as multiple personality patients. The most famous was Mary, whom he first wrote about in 1816, with a description of Mary's symptoms as preaching in her sleep, as well as writing poetry and music. While none of those activities are in and of themselves signs of mental illness, these were unusual behaviors for her and activities she was otherwise unable to do. Dr. Mitchell expanded on this account in 1860 in an article entitled The Strange Case of Mary Reynolds in Harper's New Monthly magazine. In this account, he reported that Mary was born to a devout family in England in 1785. The family later moved to Pennsylvania, and she grew up as a reserved and quiet, melancholy child. Then, inexplicably, she became blind and deaf for 6 weeks at age 19. 3 months following this, she suddenly forgot things she had learned, even having to relearn how to read and write. No longer a reserved, melancholy child, Dr. Mitchell described her now as a buoyant, witty, fond of company, and a lover of nature. Then, just as inexplicably, she reverted back to her quiet and melancholy self, without memory of either of the other two incidents. Dr. Mitchell reported that Mary Reynolds seemed to alternate these three identities, with no memory shared between them, for the next 16 years. She then maintained her more excited state until her death at age 61, but still without recall of what she experienced during the other two states of consciousness. This was the first case study that described the more functional aspects of multiplicity, that many of the separately developed talents and skills are just as valid and not unusual or maladaptive in and of themselves. In 1840, Antoine Despines published a monograph that documented the story of an 11-year-old Swiss girl, Estelle, who initially presented with paralysis and sensitivity to touch. She later displayed another personality who was quite different, could walk, liked to play, and could not tolerate her mother's presence. Despines documented this treatment course, which he reported cured the child, and many of which treatments are still recognized as valid today. This was the early description of our body memories, of our differing abilities based on the trauma response in the brain and which parts are active, and the connection between the severity of the impact of adverse childhood experiences and chronic pain, illness, and autoimmune disorders. Eugene Azam, a professor of neurology with a large interest in hypnosis, published the most detailed account of multiple personality in the 1800s. The woman, Felida X, had 3 different personalities, and he detailed what they acted like, who they were, and what caused them to appear. Felida X was born in 1843, lost her father in infancy, and had a difficult childhood. She exhibited 3 different personalities, each considering itself to be Felida's normal state and the others to be abnormal. The second personality state first manifested when Felida was 13 years old and suffered none of the physical illnesses that her first personality suffered. Initially, switching was reported to happen almost every day after a pain in the temple in her head and a profound sleep for 2 to 3 minutes, but the frequency of switching decreased over time to the point that it would happen only every 25 to 30 days and lasted only a few hours at a time. The third personality, which appeared only on occasion, suffered from anxiety attacks and hallucinations. At one point, the first personality was pregnant without explanation, and the second personality emerged and took responsibility for the pregnancy. Still, even after a great deal of research into the idea of multiple personalities, people who had symptoms like those of dissociative identity disorder were either seen as having epileptic fits or being possessed. He followed the case for 35 years and published his book about alternating personalities in the Double Consciousness in 1887. This is the early documentation as alters not just presenting as real, but perceiving themselves as real within their own awareness and consciousness. It is documentation of interactions that hint at an inner world with rules and codes and dynamics by which they lived and took turns, whether that was revealed or known or not. It tells the story of explicit switching and passive influence and natural consequences for a shared body. In 1882, the first person officially diagnosed with multiple personality disorder, instead of the previously French diagnosis of double personality, was Louis Auguste Vivet. He had been physically abused and neglected as a child and had frequent attacks of hysteria. One such of these occurred when he was 17 and bitten by a snake. He lost the use of his legs for almost 1 year, and when the use returned after a 50-hour attack, he didn't remember any of the physicians who had been treating him in an asylum for the last month, or any of his fellow patients. His manner, morals, and appetite were different as well. Following additional attacks the next year, his character would change from impulsive and dangerous to calm and gentle. In 1884, he had another attack that left him gentle of manner but unable to walk, and yet another attack returned the use of his legs but left him quarrelsome and inclined to steal as he had done as a child in order to survive. Amnesia for intervals spanning episodes was noted. By 1888, he had been recorded as having 10 personality states, each of which were different in character, memory, and somatic symptoms. This case study tells the story of individual alters, followed and observed over long periods of time, detailing their individuality, their reality, and even their humanity. This was not the delusion of one dominant personality creating lesser ones. This was a group of distinct insiders sharing a body and taking turns fronting. In 1918, multiple personalities were first acknowledged in the predecessor of the DSM under hysterical psychoneurosis, a subgroup of psychoneuroses and neuroses that included alternate states of consciousness acting on normally unknown desires, amnesia, and sensory and motor disturbances. In 1919, Pierre Genet published his work, which included several detailed accounts of multiple personalities. One was the story of Leonie, a poor and mundane woman trapped in married life. When Genet began hypnotic regression, she underwent an unprecedented metamorphosis into a lively, boisterous, and sarcastic woman who emphatically repudiated all association with the normative stream of consciousness. As if having escaped her prison, the second personality evoked her quick-wittedness and intellectual superiority and claimed biological and psychological independence from the first. Her argument rested on the internal perspective that the cerebral chasm separating the two was far too great to assume that they were one and the same person. She even said that her children belonged to her, but that the husband was a complete stranger. In time, a third personality materialized, and she was far more narcissistic and pejorative, even referring to the first personality as a good and stupid woman, but not me, and the second as a crazy creature. After 7 months of working with her, Genet realized that the fragmented personality system resembled an actualized hierarchy. The third alter knew about the second and the second only about the first, and the first was completely oblivious to the existence of the others. She appeared to have 3 or more personality states, including a child alter named after her childhood name. In the case of Lucy, who also reported to have 3 personality states, there was an alter personality named Adrian who would seem to experience flashbacks of a traumatic childhood event. In the case of Rose, she would suffer from a variety of states, in which some of them she was even paralyzed and in others she was able to walk. Genet wrote extensively about traumatic memories and how these memories could be subdivided and so cause functional loss, but also cause sensory, motor, and perceptual changes. From these changes in sensory experiences, functioning, and perception, he proposed that the mind could then present alternate personalities that were secondary to the first, much like dreams might replay themes throughout the day. He documented how, in several cases, some sub-personalities shared memories and experiences while others did not. He was also the first to explore which personalities got to drive the body, like fronting, and why. He was also the first to propose that the severity of fragmentation depended on the depth of traumatization, an idea which still prevails today. In 1906, Morton Prince published the Christine Beauchamp case in the dissociation of a personality. She allegedly had 3 personality states, including one calling herself Sally, who was childlike. Sally differed greatly from a very regressed alter called Idiot. Prince wrote about the case in a paper of the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, which was the most quoted reference in the history of the illness. After this documentation, however, No further mention of multiple personalities was mentioned in the journal until Prince's published famous account of Christine Costner Sizemore. In 1957, the case was made into a film starring Joanne Woodward playing the role of the Three Faces of Eve. It wasn't until Confusion of Tongues in 1932 that dissociation and subsequent splitting of the personality were explicitly linked to childhood abuse. However, at the time, any theory involving the subconscious mind was unpopular, and few paid attention to what had been discovered and what Jeannie Ferry herself had written all the way back in 1584. There is then an unusual gap in the literature, following Stengel's famous statement in 1943 that the condition was extinct. This statement is often used to explain the gap in literature, and the poor presentation of the article and misapplication of the conclusion confused many who misunderstood the article to mean that the condition was no longer studied or believed to happen as previously documented for over 400 years. This is entirely false and not the point of his article. It is true that the article was published during the transition between the French-speaking psychiatry and German-speaking psychiatry and the development of English-speaking psychiatry as its own field. But also, when Stengel wrote about the dissociation, he was referring to the external version, fugues, and the internal version, multiple personality. Further, the 1970s also offered the first workshops and trainings for how to treat multiple personalities. Pioneers in the field, such as Dr. Wilbur of Sybil fame, Ralph Allison, and David Cowell, developed programs and treatment workshops to teach other clinicians how to recognize, diagnose, and treat the condition, which naturally led to an increase in the number of cases diagnosed and reported once treatment for it became available. In 1980, this work culminated in the publication of the DSM-3 by the American Psychiatric Association, which for the first time created a separate category with the term dissociative being first introduced as its own class of disorders. It also officially set forth the criteria for a diagnosis of multiple personality disorder. When the DSM-3R was released, the essential feature of dissociative disorders was officially a disturbance in the normally integrative functions of identity, memory, or consciousness. Landmark publications quickly followed, including E.L. Bliss's study of 14 patients, P.M. Kuhn's systematic treatment of making a diagnosis, G.B. Greaves' classic review article, B.G. Braun's treatment recommendations, and S.S. Marmer's psychoanalytic study. Frank W. Putnam of the National Institute of Mental Health published the classic Diagnosis and Treatment of Multiple Personality Disorder, which was quickly followed by the research of Colin Ross in Multiple Personality Disorder, Diagnosis, Clinical Features, and Treatment. In 1994, the DSM-4 was released, changing the name of multiple personality disorder officially to dissociative identity disorder. The criteria for dissociative identity disorder was now the presence of two or more distinct identities or personality states, each with its own relatively enduring pattern of perceiving, relating to, and thinking about the environment and self. At least two of these identities or personality states recurrently taking control of the person's behavior. Inability to recall important personal information that is too extensive to be explained by ordinary forgetfulness. And this disturbance is not due to direct physiological effects of a substance, such as alcohol or drugs, or a result of a general medical condition, such as seizures. The DSM-5 changed this definition in 2013 to allow for self-reporting of symptoms and to specify that amnesia may occur in regards to everyday events and not just traumatic ones. 1994 also saw the International Society for the Study of Dissociation, the ISSTD, release their 100-page document, Guidelines for Treating Dissociative Identity Disorder in Adults. Screening instruments, structured interviews and assessments, and specialized mental status examinations quickly followed. While not the most authoritative, obviously, Wikipedia explains the history of the ISST most succinctly. The focus of the organization has broadened over the years. In the 1980s, the ISSMP&D, the International Society for the Study of Multiple Personality and Dissociation, grouped clinicians and researchers primarily interested in multiple personality disorder Dissociative identity disorder had been called MPD since the 19th century and was still called MPD in DSM-2 and DSM-3. In the 1990s, DSM-4 changed the name of MPD to DID, and so the ISSMP&D simplified its name to the ISSD, the International Society for the Study of Dissociation, broadening its interest to include other dissociative disorders. By the 21st century, the ISSD had broadened its interest to include chronic developmental traumatic disorders, also known as complex PTSD, and so the name was lengthened to the ISSTD, the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. Editors of the book Dissociation and the Dissociative Disorders, DSM-5 and Beyond, described the ISSTD as the principal professional organization devoted to dissociation. As such, the ISSTD revised their treatment guidelines for adults with dissociative disorders in 2011. This was the third revision, and it was published in the Journal of Trauma and Dissociation. It includes 15 pages of references, leaving the guidelines themselves at 56 pages long. The most recent theory of dissociation came from the Netherlands and has come to be called the structural dissociation theory, published in 2006. This will be discussed later in the conference more in depth, but essentially proposes that all children are born with an identity or personality that is structured with separate states, and that it is through attunement and caregiving and being raised in a healthy and safe environment by positive caregivers with good attachment that these states are integrated into one person in normal development. However, with abuse or neglect or other severe misattunement experiences, these states do not get to integrate into one personality and instead remain dissociated or separated from each other. This is a shift from the dissociation theory of the 80s and 90s that viewed the separate personality states or alters as having split off from a core personality and needing to be integrated back into that core. While some dissociative systems may still have one who views themselves or is viewed by the others as a kind of core, or some systems may have a primary personality who identifies with the body and age and even host, fronting the most often. With structural dissociation, even these would be considered alters as well, rather than some unbroken piece from which the others were derived. Besides being the first developmental model of how dissociative disorder occurs, it also clarified several issues. One is that serious and significant trauma prior to the age of 6 is more likely to develop into a trauma response like dissociative identity disorder, while serious and significant trauma after age 9 is more likely to develop into a personality disorder. These may overlap in presentation, and the structural dissociation model explains this by labeling different internal parts as A and P, apparently normal parts, or as EP, emotional parts. There may or may not be amnesia between these parts, and the degree of amnesia correlates to the specific diagnosis along the dissociative spectrum. Another explanation that came out of this model was the idea of how different dissociative systems are organized based on the type of trauma response. For example, an adult who dissociates in response to one traumatic event in adulthood may separate themselves from the memory or emotional response to that event. On the other hand, an adult who had a series of traumatic events may have multiple separations of memories or emotional responses to those events. And then an adult who grew up with ongoing abuse and repeated traumatic events, while also being unable to integrate ego states during childhood development, may have several presenting adults as well as the multiple emotional states. There are diagrams on the blog at systemspeak.org to help with understanding. Kathy Steele, international speaker on dissociative disorders and one of the founders of the structural dissociation theory, rejects the ANP and EP terms in favor of her own model. She uses DL for daily living parts for ANPs and TF for trauma-fixated parts for EPs. The other big research getting a lot of attention in the field of dissociative disorders is the polyvagal theory, which will also be discussed in future sessions of this conference. The vagus is a nerve that runs from the brain to all the major organs by branching out along the way, and thus called the polyvagal nerve, We will talk about this more in depth in the session about this topic, but for now, there are two things to know about this theory. One is that it helps explains why bottom-up approaches help survivors of trauma so much. Bottom-up means working with the body itself through a variety of ways to help the amygdala regulate the physiologic response to trauma, even trauma in memory time being felt in now time. So bottom-up approaches are things like meditation, yoga, EMDR, pet therapy, equine therapy, sand tray, art, sensory therapies, as opposed to top-down approaches like talk therapy that work through activating the medial prefrontal cortex. The best and most effective is a bit of both top-down and bottom-up. The other thing that this theory brought to light is that healing from trauma and shame require a social aspect to the therapeutic approach. Healing requires connection with another. There has been an understanding that emotional safety is part of creating the space in which the therapeutic work can happen and progress be made. But now that emotional safety is defined as including attunement specifically. Attunement is being in tune with and reflected by another, being heard, being seen, feeling held in someone's heart, and there being some level of reciprocity. But here's the funny thing about the polyvagal theory being all the rage right now. It isn't new. It's not new at all. Stephen Porges introduced the idea all the way back in 1994. That brings us to another piece of history that matters. Changes in the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States for funding research. The change started in 2010 with the From Discovery to Cure report, which basically stated that the traditional research with traditional clinical trials and decades of follow-up research was simply too costly. They simply stopped funding psychological and psychosocial research, period. Starting in 2014, they cut off all of those projects and now only fund neuroscience research. This did two things. First, it shifted funding back to biological and neurological research. This is why some of the brilliant psychological researchers of the 80s and 90s suddenly disappeared or started publishing in other fields. They simply lost funding. It's also why we saw a resurgence of research with things like the polyvagal theory, which was biological enough to count for funding, as well as a new focus on new technology like functional MRIs and neurofeedback. The second thing it did was create opportunity for new people wanting fresh money now made available. The buzzword became evidence-based, which was a way to tie research back to science rather than psychological studies and experiments. At its best, that gave us some new techniques that have been really helpful and widely accepted. And at its worst, it began a pattern for repackaged fad therapies being branded and marketed as the latest thing and evidence-based, but not actually including appropriate application or sample sizes or well-developed studies. This has divided clinicians into two camps of thought, often with heated exchanges between them. One camp is the traditional therapies camp, who thinks the other group is simply out to make money from the funding and from clients by coming up with miracle cures that are short-term and fast-acting treatments, but don't actually have any long-term studies backing them up. The other camp is the new short-term therapies camp, who thinks the first group are the ones just trying to make money off of long-term treatments. Stuck in the middle are survivors themselves, either doubting or buying into these different treatments without really knowing what is best or how to even tell which approaches are best for them. In addition, Susan Peace Bannett points out trauma studies cannot be evidence-based by the very nature of trauma. Evidence-based therapies are only studied for an average of 6 to 9 months because, remember, long-term studies lost funding. Extensive trauma histories will take longer than that to build enough safety and connection to even start disclosing trauma. Further, she also points out that trauma is often triggered by anniversary dates or external factors, so many issues may not even come up for a whole year into treatment. This is not only bad practice, but also an injustice for the client, when poorly studied and barely tested models are being applied to trauma treatment for survivors who have already endured so much. But not only do treatments change, the diagnosis itself continues to change. The upcoming release of the ISSTD-11 will classify dissociative identity disorder as being characterized by the disruption of identity in which there are two or more distinct personality states, dissociative identities, associated with marked discontinuities in the sense of self and agency. Each personality state includes its own pattern of experiencing, perceiving, conceiving, and relating to the self, the body, and the environment. At least two distinct personality states recurrently take executive control of the individual's consciousness and functioning in interacting with others or with the environment, such as the performance of specific aspects of daily life, such as parenting or work, or in response to specific situations, such as those that are perceived as threatening. Changes in personality state are accompanied by related alterations in sensations, perception, affect, cognition, memory, motor control, and behavior. There are typically episodes of amnesia which may be severe. The symptoms are not only better explained by another mental, behavioral, or neurodevelopmental disorder, and are not due to the direct effects of substance or medication on the central nervous system, including withdrawal effects, and are not due to a disease of the nervous system or a sleep-wake disorder. The symptoms result in significant impairment in personal, family, social, educational, occupational, or other areas of functioning. We'll also be adding a partial dissociative identity disorder diagnosis, presumably to replace OSDD. This diagnosis also contains new language regarding switching, ANP to EP, as a dissociative intrusion. It also refers to passive influence, or the influence of other alters without them presenting directly or fronting completely or co-consciously. While not yet confirmed, it appears based on common interpretation thus far that this distinguishes secondary dissociation as PDD, previously OSDD, and now partial dissociative identity disorder, and tertiary dissociation as DID explicitly. The ISSTD-11 will also shift fugue to a general dissociative amnesia category. Despite the release of the DSM-5 2 years later in 2013, the upcoming release of the ISSTD-11, the latest theory of structural dissociation, and the renewed emphasis on the polyvagal theory, the ISSTD still has not updated its guidelines since 2011, and even that update did not include any references or research past 2009, making their treatment guidelines outdated by an entire decade. Our specific concerns in regards to this include the language of using the word patients instead of clients, the diagnostic manual changes, and the need for functional multiplicity to be included as a treatment option. However, last week I spoke to Peter Barish, who helped write the treatment guidelines for the ISSTD, and asked him these questions directly. He responded in several helpful ways to communicate and explain the ISSTD stance on this issue. The following is my understanding of his response. I am not quoting him directly, and you may listen to that podcast episode to hear him speak in his own words. Most of the original treatment providers were medical doctors or psychiatrists, and the original context of the treatment guidelines were for insurance panels approving inpatient hospital stays. In these contexts, using the word patients was the appropriate use of the word, which I concur based on my own years of working in hospitals and residential treatment programs. The Latin roots for the word clients means to lean on, which ultimately made both clinicians and survivors uncomfortable with the use of that word, and so patients remained the better option out of those choices. The changes brought about by the DSM-5 were not the expected changes. It was expected that the developmental trauma disorder or complex PTSD would be added as a diagnosis, and it wasn't. This chain of events is described well in the book The Body Keeps Score. What did change in the DSM-5 was self-reporting symptoms becoming acceptable, and DD-NOS becoming OSDD. However, neither of these changes impacted treatment itself directly, and so did not require an update to the guidelines. Functional multiplicity happens naturally already in the treatment process, as communication and cooperation improve as a system. In that way, most ethical and good therapists already understand this as a goal for part of treatment, even if it is not explicitly stated in the guidelines. It should be expected that we attain this part of treatment process naturally, both through treatment itself and through our own work as a system that we do outside of or in addition to the treatment setting. That said, functional multiplicity is not an end goal for treatment for two reasons, both of which are related to the ACEs research and long-term follow-up studies, which are new for the first time and were not available in the 80s and 90s. The first reason is that it leaves a survivor at a higher risk of being re-traumatized or re-victimized in some way, not because the survivor is not functioning with a positive quality of life, but because they remain in a dissociated state, which leaves them, by definition, with decreased awareness of themselves and their surroundings in some ways. The second reason builds on that, in regards to both the liability and the ethics of leaving a client in that high-risk state in a more vulnerable position. Thus, from a perspective of beginning a conversation between the clinical and survivor communities about these issues, the survivor community is concerned about agency, the ability to choose, and intentionality, the choice itself, while the clinical community is concerned about the safety and increased adaptability rather than continuing to rely only on dissociation. Survivors seem to voice an opinion that is in regards to the quality of life and wanting to measure their own progress, while clinicians are expressing concerns regarding what would put that quality of life at risk. While there are clearly differences of opinions in these perspectives, the biggest trigger for survivors may simply be facing the "we know what's good for you" approach that feels generally oppressive despite its reportedly good intentions. This may be what is more difficult to resolve than the differences themselves. Clinicians will need to find sensitive and respectful means to support the survivor during later phases of therapy, including ways to honor both agency and intentionality as part of the healing process. Survivors will need to continue to advocate for themselves in ways that are effective, while also continuing to engage in the therapeutic process. Finally, the latest research continues to be in neuroscience because it can get funding, and much of it is focusing on what we are learning from functional MRIs. The first MRI with documented switching was all the way back in 1999. But just a few months ago, in December of last year, the British Journal of Psychiatry released spectacular results on the fMRI studies. Neuroscience News reported that fMRIs were able to distinguish with 73% accuracy neurobiological differences between those with dissociative identity disorder and those without the condition. They wrote, "This research, using the largest ever sample of individuals with DID in a brain imaging study, is the first to demonstrate that individuals with DID can be distinguished from healthy individuals on the basis of their brain structure. DID, formerly known as multiple personality disorder, is one of the most disputed and controversial mental health disorders, with serious problems around underdiagnosis and misdiagnosis. Many patients with DID share a history of misdiagnoses, inefficient pharmacological treatment, and several hospitalizations." Commenting on the research, Dr. Rhonda said, "DID diagnosis is controversial, and individuals with DID are often misdiagnosed. From the moment of seeking treatment for symptoms to the time of an accurate diagnosis of DID, individuals receive an average of 4 misdiagnoses and spend 7 years in mental health services. The findings of our present study are important because they provide the first evidence of a biological basis for distinguishing between individuals with DID and healthy individuals. Ultimately, the application of pattern recognition techniques could prevent unnecessary suffering through earlier and more accurate diagnosis, facilitating faster and more targeted therapeutic interventions." Further, using what has been learned from polyvagal theory, shame theory, and structural dissociation theory, there is renewed interest in the actual neurobiological mechanisms of how DID develops. Some of this also builds on fMRIs, where brain structural changes are noted. In DID, reduced volumes in the amygdala and hippocampus and parahippocampus were found. Smaller hippocampal volumes may be related to early life trauma. The hippocampus has a high density of receptors and is highly sensitive to a heightened release of the stress hormone cortisol. Therefore, chronic traumatic stress may lead to cell damage in this area. Reduced hippocampal volumes in PTSD may therefore stem from a history of trauma rather than be specific to the diagnosis. Building on this, there is a coalescence theory that explains how the structure of DID happens neurophysiologically. This theory links default mode network, DMN, to both default mechanisms and altered states of consciousness. The DMN is a group of interactive brain regions whose activity is highly correlated, meaning they all work together at once. Bouncing back from earlier criticism, the DMN has now been mapped not only on fMRIs, but also PET scans and electrocardiography. The DMN is most active during wakeful rest, such as daydreaming, mind-wandering, and dissociation. Thanks to recent fMRI research, we now know the DMN also contributes to aspects of experiencing one's role externally, as well as the ability to think about ourselves and remember the past. In the infant brain, there is limited evidence of the default network, but default network connectivity is more consistent in children aged 9 to 12 years, suggesting that the default network undergoes developmental change. This seems to confirm theories about extreme trauma responses prior to age 9 developing as DID, and trauma responses after age 9 developing as personality disorders. There are many differences amongst us in the community. DID presents differently in everyone, and is experienced differently by everyone. Some of us have been working at our healing for many years, while others of us are just getting started. Still others don't remember trauma, while others deny having any trauma background at all. Sometimes our awareness changes simply depending on who is out. But today, this weekend, at this first counter conference, we unite together to use our voice in a way like never before. We stand together against being silenced by clinicians who are neither properly educated nor properly trained. We stand together against being silenced by government funding agencies who ignore our declarations that they have long been a part of the problem and in some cases caused the problem. We stand together against being silenced by dissension in research camps where politics argue over money like fighting parents, and where funding unethically determines the access to services, and where clinical pirates reproduce old research for credit and money at the expense of our healing being put on hold for decades. We raise our voices to say, nothing for us without us. This was our discussion at the recent Infinite Mind Conference in Florida, when 15 Plural systems met together over several days that weekend to discuss concerns experienced while at the conference. Sign language interpreters were refused, and alternative handouts and transcripts promised were never provided, and the videos used, like the ones on the ISSTD website also, were not captioned, despite that being federal law as well for years now, altogether making the conference inaccessible to deaf and hard of hearing survivors. Seeing Eye Dogs were twice kicked out of the conference, and PowerPoint presentations did not include image descriptions, making the conference inaccessible to the blind and visually impaired survivors in attendance. Following these slights and legal violations against the disability community, that conference organizer was asked to present about disability and trauma at the ISSTD conference this weekend, rather than someone from the disability community themselves, which again is cultural appropriation. Presenters also openly mocked animal, feral, fictive, and alien alters during their presentations, despite redirection by survivors themselves that the appropriate term for these are non-human alters, and without consideration that any such introjects would have developed in the minds of intelligent and creative children based on their own unique traumatic experiences, as well as their own specific cultural references growing up in the 90s and 2000s, which provides a very different presentation than those who grew up in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but makes them no less legitimate. Presenters continue to follow the ISSTD treatment guidelines, which state that survivors ought to be isolated from each other with no contact outside of group, and present themselves as both dismissive and disrespectful to those who attempt to educate and connect and support other survivors. And presenters and organizations are attempting to aggregate and monetize online educational resources, which is again unethical appropriation, and worse, feels like organizational abuse, which many of us have already endured as our call for information and access and connection is dismissed, while they then take control of disseminating information and resources while excluding those of us who have been doing it already for years. This is not 1980. It's been more than 40 years since 1980. More than half of your survivors were barely even born in 1980. DID is not going to look the same, sound the same, or present the same now as it did in 1980 because those clients grew up in the 40s and 50s and 60s. The cause may be the same, and the process may be the same, but the presentation comes in a whole new generation, 4 decades later. Introjects look different, persecutors look different, and inner worlds look different. That doesn't make any of it less valid, and it is cruel and re-traumatizing for anyone to dismiss survivors because the culture we grew up in and had access to during childhood and adolescence was different than it was almost 100 years ago. It is 2019. More than half of us grew up in the 80s and 90s and 2000s and 2010s. It is the digital world, and you cannot keep us isolated from each other. We no longer grow up in a world never having met someone like us. DID is everywhere. It is misportrayed in mass media, misunderstood by pop culture, and misrepresented by old text and outdated treatment models. We are survivors, keen on discernment and gifted with hypervigilance. We grew up in the digital age, and we know that not everything on YouTube is true, and not every DID channel is real. We know that there is a difference between those who share their stories online in helpful and educated ways and those who fake it for clickbait and quick money. We know that some support groups on Facebook will be healthy peer support like no other place available to us, while others are nasty pools of trauma dumping. We know that Twitter and Reddit and Tumblr can be opportunities for connection and education and advocacy, or places of terrifying drama and cyberbullying. We already know these things, and most of us can discern the difference. Stand with us instead of leaving us alone in it. Collaborate instead of letting us drown on our own. Teach us instead of dismissing us. Empower us to heal, even through connection and attunement, which is exactly the message of all the latest research on shame. We are just asking you to see us and hear us, and to please not become the bad guys. We agree with the concern of a person or system or part of a system over-identifying with their role online, rather than progression through the healing journey. So support us as we focus on the healing aspects, such as communication, cooperation, and collaboration, inside and outside the system. These issues are not only the modern age of clinical cultural competence, but also an opportunity for compassion. This is what led us to organize this counter conference, intentionally timing it simultaneously with the ISSTD conference happening this weekend in New York. Let me be clear, we are not protesting that conference, nor are we arguing against the ISSTD. We declare our legal rights for accessible treatments and trainings, as well as our ethical right to culturally competent treatment for these new generations. And some of the issues we would like addressed by the clinical community include the following. The decade-old treatment guidelines by the ISSTD need to be updated, such as patients should be changed to clients. And while we now understand their origin better, it has been decades since hospitals were closed, and we are not a generation that grew up in patient, and client has a more modern feel despite its unfortunate Latin roots. Research should also be updated, terminology for non-human alters clarified, functional multiplicity included as a viable and valid treatment outcome, or at least acknowledged as part of the process, and using other language such as metabolizing experiences rather than integrating them, Now the integration has such a negative connotation that it's actually become triggering verbiage in and of itself. While we understand the difficulty with parts language and the need for emphasis on the functional whole, and we do even agree that the term emotional parts is severely limited, trauma-fixated parts is not a valid replacement for the EP term due to the interference of intentionality. It implies blame, which is shaming, and those parts stuck in time or trauma loops are not the same as fixating on that trauma, nor is it helpful for those parts to be shamed further for their experience. The general attitude regarding survivors having contact with each other needs to change, especially in regards to the online community. For years, we have been isolated from each other, and it was recommended we not have contact with one another. There is no other physical or mental illness given those recommendations. All other physical and mental illnesses include treatment recommendations for support groups and communities of others who understand, which is consistent with the most recent research on attunement and shame and healing through connection. We understand that isolating only within that group is not healthy, as mentioned under Safety and Reciprocity subheading in Chapter 5 of The Body Keeps Score. But these generations growing up online anyway cannot be expected not to reach out and find others who understand them, and it is culturally incompetent to expect that. What would be more helpful would be supporting those who are trying to do it well and providing safe places and disseminating accurate information as best they can to so many desperate for resources. We know not everything on the internet is true, or real, or even safe, and we are probably better at spotting abusers. Let us have our safe places in which we can rest and connect with others who understand. When you have those rare occasions of those who copycat others that they witness online, then treat them as you would any other introject, just like from a parenting figure or a book. This generation of introjects is digitally based and very different presentation than those 20 years ago or 40 years ago. It doesn't make them less real or less valid or less important. We know in differing degrees, but especially once we have been in therapy, that we are parts of a whole. Please interact with us as we present, just like you would for any other client. There are reasons why we function that way as a system, and listening to us will help you understand us more and help us trust you more quickly. Please stop referring to working with individual parts as joining the delusion. Dissociation is not the same as a delusion, and it is oppressive and shaming when you say so, which is a rupture to our connection with you. Emphasize more in your education and trainings and publications that healing is a journey. Kathy Steele said that integration is not a fixed moment, but a process, and no different for you than for us, other than our dissociated starting place. You aren't finished either, so have some empathy for us and compassion for our struggle with the process. None of us are the same person we were yesterday. Metabolizing experiences, feelings, and memories should be the focus of therapeutic work, along with the safety and stabilization, including sensory motor and physical grounding work, as well as compassion and connection to address shame issues. This is what brings about functional multiplicity and proves both internal and external communication, cooperation, and collaboration.
Peter Barish told me that David Cowell said, "It seems to me that after treatment, you want a functional unit, be it a corporation, a partnership, or a one-owner business."
We stand with those clinicians who see us and hear us and treat us ethically and compassionately. We stand with those clinicians who do their own work enough not to be offended by the cultural shifts in dissociative presentations, the expression of DID in younger generations with different cultural experiences to draw on as they dissociate, and new styles of introjects based on global access to digital literature. We stand with those clinicians who are receptive to feedback, who share the reins with new and qualified colleagues, and who collaborate with the community as a whole, and not just the professional world as a place to hide or establish power over those already victimized. We stand with those organizations who respond to feedback, who include survivors on their boards and advisory panels, and who support fresh ideas for connection and healing instead of dividing the community further. And we are calling for a renewal to reclaim our healing environment from the last 20 years and pleading for a bridge to be built between the clinical and survivor communities. We don't need you to be magic. We don't need you to integrate us into one. We have never asked for any of that. Some may choose it, but it ought not be forced on any of us. We want to be safe. We want to feel connected. We want to be able to function and have access to all parts or aspects of our lives. Plurality doesn't bother us. We've always been this way. It takes ages to get diagnosed and even longer to find a good therapist and even longer to get well. Being plural isn't even the hard part about DID. What bothers us is the getting hurt and the not knowing and the shame. And when you stop and think about the current DSM-5 criteria, dissociative identity disorder is only a disorder when you're distressed by it and can't function. Help us not to be so distressed. Help us function, then we won't be disordered. We can handle the rest. There's a lot of positivity about being plural.
Thank you for joining us with System Speak, a podcast about dissociative identity disorder. You can listen to the podcast on Spotify, Google Play, and iTunes, or follow along on our website, www.systemspeak.org. Thanks for listening.